I absolutely love the Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation series. After watching the first season, I fell in love with the franchise. I immediately went out and I bought all of what I can get of the novel series. And of course, I have been reading through and doing analysis on the entire novel series itself. And yes, as you would expect, I have found a lot of things that were completely skipped from the novel series going to the anime adaptation. And thus, the creation of the most insane things that was skipped in the anime adaptation of Season 1. A list of moments, backstories, and concepts that were left out on the cutting board when it went to the anime adaptation. Now, these are some things that could possibly be covered in some other way later on in the adaptation, but for the most part, everything here I believe are kind of skipped for the sake of making things a lot more simple in the adaptation. So I don't see them getting back to them. But with that said, there's a lot. So this is my first of 2 segments of the most insane moments skipped. For our first skip content, we have the emphasis that the novel gives upon how really truly smart Rudeus is. I mean, from the perspective of an anime only, it really gives the indication of this deadbeat NEET. He's an idiot, he then gets isekai'd, and then he tries to change his life. But honestly, from the very get-go of the novel, it starts to get into the idea that, yes, Rudeus was actually an academic. Like, he was really smart when he was younger, and he had really great grades. It was just everything that kind of befell him later on in his life, in his previous life, that's where everything kind of went downhill, but he was still smart. And this sort of applies to the story itself, as you see that he's kind of pushing himself to absorbing as much knowledge as possible. I mean, he seeks out the Grey Rat family library to learn as much as he can, learn all these different languages. This is something that was kind of instilled upon him in his previous life. It isn't just the fact that he's in a child's body and he's able to absorb stuff more. That's just how he is. It was just based on what all happened to him in his previous life with the bullying and everything. That's kind of what shut him out. And it sort of applies to his abilities as well, as you see that he's able to do incantationless spells, which Rudeus believes that the reason why he's able to pull that off is because he has knowledge of how things work, the physics of things itself. And that's the only reason why he's not able to do incantationless spells when it comes to healing, because he doesn't know exactly how, closing a wound actually works. And this is the thing that later on has him really understanding that Sylphie is so much better than him, is because she doesn't seem to have that knowledge, but yet she's able to pull that off, as well as Sylphie's able to do incantationless healing, which is something that Paul brings up to him. And Paul himself is surprised. I thought you could do incantation everything. For our next skip content, we really have the emphasis in the first volume around Lilia, her past with Paul, and yes, the early stages of Rudeus' life. As we find out, yes, Lilia thought Rudeus was possessed. She had a run-in with a child in the palace, the Osprey Palace, where she worked at, that sort of showed the same characteristics, being, moving around and walking around early and all that kind of stuff. So she thought that Rudeus was possessed. So she actually went out into the village one day, used all the remaining money that she had to buy things to perform an exorcist on Rudeus, which kind of shows the aspect of how willing she is to help out Paul's family, despite the fact that her rough past with Paul, but that she's willing to help fix Rudeus. But no, I think overall with Volume 1 and additionally Volume 6, we get a lot of perspective on Lilia herself and really her relationship with Paul in their past. Through a sequence of 3 different flashbacks from Paul's perspective, Lilia's perspective, and a third-person perspective, we see that they had a really rough first introduction. And that's kind of one of the sad things that was skipped in the anime, is that we see that Paul one day visited this sword hall that Lilia was basically working at. Her father owned the hall. And we find out that Lilia did not have a brother that would take over the hall, so they were essentially going to find somebody to essentially wed Lilia in order to take over the hall. And Paul was a prospective person to take over that. And yes, because Paul's an idiot, it seems like from his perspective, everybody was bullying him and everybody was jealous about how skilled he was. But actually, from Lilia's perspective, we see that, no, they loved Paul. Despite the fact that he was kind of a jerk and full of himself, they wanted him to have the seat. But the fact that he put such little value to something everybody else was striving for, to take Lilia and take the seat, they lashed out at him. And that's what led him to eventually lash back by deflowering Lilia and then running off. And this has pretty much ruined Lilia's entire life. I think the one thing I got from the novel that I never got from the anime was how much Paul screwed up Lilia's life. Because from that point, she could no longer see herself with men. Her father basically sent her off to the Osprey Palace to have a life being a maid. There she got pretty much forced upon Eventually, she got this assassination attempt that she prevented. Then they discarded her because she was no longer useful. And that's when she finally stumbled upon the help wanted for Paul's family and took on that job. Yes, using the fact that he did that to her and to push her way in. This is probably one of the funniest moments that was skipped in the anime that I could not stop laughing at when I read. And I read it over and over again to make sure that I'm reading it right. The moment that Paul decides to send Rudeus off to train Edis, he essentially knocks out Rudeus. As he's going towards the carriage with Rudeus in hand, knocked out, Sylphie and her father, Laws, is showing up at the house, and Paul is like, crap, why'd you have to show up now? Sylphie springs into an attack against Paul because he believes that Paul hurt Rudeus. Well, he technically did. And she fires off incantationless spells towards him. Paul's able to deflect it, but he notes that if he did not, they would probably prove fatal. Yes, Sylphie nearly killed Paul because he knocked him out. Oh, it's so crazy to think about, like, why did they skip that? That's so crazy. And again, it goes into the mindset of what they're establishing here. Paul did this because he felt like Rudeus and Sylphie were too codependent upon each other, and that Rudeus might harm Sylphie if he were to give up on her or something. He knew that Sylphie was so dependent upon Rudeus. She'd been hanging around him so much that all she can think about was Rudeus, and he wanted to separate the two of them. And so at this point, as Laws is basically reprimanding Sylphie for doing that, Paul's thinking to himself, go, Laws, you need to reclaim your daughter. You need to get her focus back towards you and lead her in the path that she needs to go because, again, she's too dependent upon Rudeus. And I think this is something that, as we reintroduce to Sylphie later, possibly, what mindset can we see there? We did see later on with this brief little vision of them at the house and Sylphie coming in with the pendant, that yes, it seems like she's kind of gotten some independence since Rudeus had left, but it's still crazy to see how willing she was to kill Paul in this moment. This part hurt that it was skipped, and yes, that is the birth of Norn and Aisha. The anime really doesn't cover that process whatsoever, and it was a very telling process to the minds of characters like Zenith. It was a very, very strenuous birth. They brought in a lady to help them out. Lilia was experienced in it, so she was able to help Zenith with her birth process of Norn. But thankfully, Lilia was experienced in this. The entire time this process is going, Rudeus is constantly there aiding, providing water, and even healing Zenith the entire time. He was exerting so much effort in healing his mother during this very difficult pregnancy. And yes, finally when Norn is born, immediately Lilia goes into premature birth. And thankfully the lady was able to help Lilia with that whole process. But again, this kind of really instilled upon Zenith, and you'll find this out with Zenith's Perspective later on in the first volume, which I believe everybody should read, instilled upon Zenith that he truly cared for his family. Despite the fact that we constantly see this perspective that Rudeus just doesn't really have any bonds, these are those signs of those bonds that he has. And sadly, never really seen in the anime. Which, yes, leads to the other extremely sad skipping that the anime did. We did get a brief scene at the end of the first season that showed Zenith's perspective as she was thinking about Rudeus and then says, I love you, Rudeus. But that scene was at the end of the first volume, and there's a lot more context here. And like I said earlier, a lot of that context is the perspective that Zenith isn't an idiot. In the point where we had the whole family feud happening when Lilia announced that she was pregnant as well, there was one very important scene that was skipped, and that was that Rudeus, upon the fallout of everything that happened, and, you know, him begging for mom to forgive Lilia and to take Lilia in, he follows Zenith because he believes that their family's gonna fall apart and that would be terrible for his future. So he goes to Zenith, knocks on her door, she pokes her head out, and he apologizes, tells her that he was lying, that everything he said about Paul and Lilia was a lie. And you know what Zenith said? I know. She knew he was lying, but she allowed it to happen because she knew how important it was to Rudeus to keep the family together. And in the end, she did love Lilia, and she didn't want to kick Lilia out. Zenith is much more smarter than the anime kind of gives us a sense of. She really was kind of the motherly figure that kind of stands aside and just kind of allows things to happen, gets angry for a brief moment, but then kind of sighs and lets everything pass. Zenith was really conflicted in that period of time. And this extends to that extra chapter where we see from her perspective that, yes, she believes that Rudeus really truly cares for that family. And it kind of emphasizes it a little more in the perspective of Lilia and Aisha in the idea that, yes, as she's feeding Norn, Rudeus realizes that Aisha is hungry too. But at the time, Lilia isn't there. And so Rudeus sort of tries to nudge Zenith about the fact that Aisha is hungry. And he's afraid that she wouldn't feed Aisha because this is the baby that is the product of Lilia cheating on her husband. But still she accepts to bring Aisha up. Additionally, in this scene, we get a sense of that element of Rudeus realizing the difference between lustfully looking at a woman and looking at family. As she kind of points out the fact that he always looks at her and has that pervy face, but this time she kind of pokes at him and he immediately looks away in embarrassment. He realizes, I really shouldn't be looking at this. And so it embarrasses him. What it all comes down to is this brief moment where, and I think it's sort of covered in the anime, Zenith thanks Rudeus for being there because Rudeus showed her what was important. Rudeus has helped them so much with these children, helped them so much with his family. Zenith is truly thankful that Rudeus was born. She loves him, thanks him, and in return, he thanks her for birthing him. Really goofy kind of end to that whole scene, but it is a truly special scene that I think everybody should check out because there's so much context there that really does establish this relationship of this family. Please go check out that extra chapter of Volume 1. One particular thing in Volume 2 that was skipped in the anime was specifically the history of the world itself. And this is kind of one of those ones where I believe it could be covered at some point, but it essentially starts from the point of 100,000 years ago with the establishment of the 7 worlds. And each one of these worlds had a god that kind of proceeded over it until one day the dragon god, the evil dragon god, was born in the dragon realm, and he broke the barrier between the worlds and essentially started conquering each of these worlds until they were all destroyed and they came to one world. And that's why we have the world that we have right now in Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation. It's this one single world with all these different races. It's because they all had to flee to this one world. And it follows this whole thing with how the entire continent itself, which was one continent, was split in half by a gigantic attack. And eventually you have the separation of the races themselves until eventually we have the conquest of Laplace invading each of the territories to try to take over everything. It really does give you an in-depth perspective of how essentially the world that we're looking at now was molded over so many thousands of years. And I think, again, it's kind of one of those things where they may eventually go, well, let's talk about this. And they'll go over it. But I kind of wish that was something that they hit on in especially the segment of the anime where it's at. Because, again, that was the point in which Rudeus was really starting to get academic and looking into a lot of information such as languages and stuff. They could have easily gone over this. But yeah, check out Volume 2, Chapter 6 if you want to look into that stuff. My gosh, this was super surprising. Not that it was skipped. There's one aspect of this that was skipped, but more so that this was sort of changed in a way that I really feel really loses its impact, for sure. And that is the story of the Superds. The point in which they're at Midgard Village, and at some point, Rizurd tells his story. And I really felt like in the anime, the way that it was worded emphasized this idea that, yes, Laplace came to the Superds with the spears, the Superds took the spears, and they went out and attacked, and eventually it took over their minds, they went crazy, battle crazy, and at some point they were stopped. His son stopped him. And he keeps the spear of his son in order to remind himself of everything that happened. In the novels, there's much more clarification here in the idea that it's not just that the Superds did this. Rizurd did this. Yes, Rizurd was the commander of the Superd army. And when they came before Laplace and he gave them the demon spears, Rizurd commanded his men to drop their spears and take the cursed spears. Why this is so significant is because they're not supposed to let go of their spears. Their spears is their soul, their life, their everything. They're born with it. And I'll get into more of that later. But I think the emphasis on the idea that Rizurd himself told them, commanded them to take on these cursed spears, it makes this whole story so much more personal. Because again, Rizurd was betrayed by Laplace, And he was the cause of their deaths, their downfall, and the curse of the perspective of everybody upon the Superds themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, yes, this is important also in the idea that they're not supposed to let go of their spears. Because yes, the Superds themselves, their spear is their soul. It gets stronger with them. And this is kind of an oddity that could be possibly covered later on. But yes, they're born with a tail. That tail over time grows. It will stiffen, fall off, and that becomes their spear. So yes, the Superds' tail is their spear. And that's why it grows with them, and it's a part of them, and it gains strength with them. The later part of Reserve's story that's really more tragic is the idea that eventually they get turned on, they get betrayed. They're told that there is an attack happening at a village, and so the Superds basically out of their minds at this point. If there's something in front of them, they will attack it. As they mentioned in the anime as well, they have no distinction between, foe or ally. So when they go to this village, they're told to go there because they're saying they're being attacked, but that was their plan. When they got to the village, it was Reserve's village, and they massacred everybody. The villagers, like they got there and they immediately just started attacking the village. Like they're supposed to go there to help, but they went there to destroy them. And yes, that's the point in which Reserve snaps out of it. He wakes up. The demon spear that he'd been holding was shattered, and it was his son that shattered it. And as Reserve gained his consciousness, and at the time he was chewing down on something, and it was his son's finger. He killed his son. And again, that makes it so much more impactful how that was portrayed and the story that was told there. And this continues the idea that at that point they're surrounded. He wakes up all the other Superds. At that point, all that's left is about 10 of them. And they all scatter because they're surrounded. And so he doesn't even know if the other ones are alive. Again, the way it was told in the novel was so much more personal. It puts so much more weight upon Reserve's shoulders that he messed up. And that he would want to repair that. This all kind of feeds into my theory right now that I don't believe that Reserve is carrying his son's spear. He mentions the idea that his son was training, but he wasn't a honed warrior. And the idea of a spear being carried by his son, able to break these cursed spears they're carrying from Laplace, doesn't make much sense. But Reserve didn't have his spear. He had put his spear down to pick up the cursed spear. So I believe that his son probably picked up Reserve's spear and used that to break the cursed spear. But that's my theory right now. I'm not looking for answers on it. We'll probably find out later. I truly love how clever this writer is. And one example of it is the feud between Dead End and Nokopara. In the anime, Nokopara shows up and says, "Oh, I know exactly what you're doing. I forced them to tell me what's going on." And he's going to reveal all the secrets about Dead End trading jobs with the other party and making money that way. And so, yes, Reserve douses his hair, and everybody freaks out. In the novel, it goes into this really crafty thing, because the entire time, he had these other two essentially spread the word of Dead End, do our lower ranking jobs, and run around and tell everybody about how great Dead End is. And Rudeus uses this fact against Nokopara. He goes into the guild and has the other two party members join Dead End. And then he goes back to Nokopara and says, "You have no proof that we've been trading jobs." And so Nokopara goes, "Well, let's see." He goes into the guild, he takes the logs for Dead End, and they go to each one of these clients. He asks the client, "Who helped you with your insect problem?" And they immediately go, "Dead End, obviously." Because again, these two were doing exactly what Rudeus told them, spreading the word about how great Dead End is, and basically acting as if they are Dead End. And they went to each one of these clients, and they kept saying, "Dead End, obviously, Dead End helped me, not Pea Hunters," which that was their group. It wasn't until they ran into Kurt. And for those who don't remember, Kurt was the one that Reserve and Rudeus saved in the Petrified Forest. And so yes, this guy walks up and says, "Hey, how's it going, Pea Hunters?" And that messed up everything. That was the point in which Nokopara said, "Wait, so Dead End didn't help you? Pea Hunters did." Well, these guys aren't Pea Hunters, they're Dead End. And that messed up everything. And that was the point in which, yes, Reserve reveals himself and they have to leave. But again, I thought it was really clever in how it was so much more than just, "Oops, we messed up, tee-hee." It was really like this act of Rudeus really twisting the situation, using the setup that he already did to really try to fight back against Nokopara before giving up. My gosh, this next one was so interesting in the idea that, man, things got really heated at Zant Port. For those that don't remember, we had this whole segment where Rudeus gets attacked by the Doldia people. They take him off to be in prisoner. Well, at the same time, Reserve was escorting the Beastfolk children to go to Zant Port. But he didn't want to enter Zant Port because He was afraid they would think that he kidnapped them, because that's what Rizard always experiences. He saves children, he takes them to villages to, give them back, and they think that he's the kidnapper. What we don't get in the anime is that things escalated really badly, as the Beastfolk wanted answers. They wanted to go into the Zant Port and free the other children. There were more people trapped on the boats. Rizard immediately went in there and attacked and freed them all. And Zant Port wanted to prosecute him for doing that. But the Beastfolk spoke up. Why did you allow this? And your officials were being paid to overlook it. The Beastfolk were mad that Zant Port was allowing their children to be taken away as slaves. There was a war about to break out at Zant Port between the Beastfolk and the vanguard of the Zant Port. Until eventually the Zant Port said, oh, sorry, our bad. Here's some money. Please overlook this. Which, in the end, yes, somebody ends up getting paid again. It was a little sad that we had one entire chapter was skipped by the anime adaptation, and that was the displacement of Ghislaine. Yes, Ghislaine ended up somewhere too. Remember, she was caught in that light too. Which, yes, as you can kind of figure out based on the conversations that Edis has with Ghislaine the moment that she arrives back at the refugee camp, that yes, Ghislaine was somewhere near the conflict zone. Yes, she actually appeared in the northern area of the conflict zone. And not only that, but there was a conflict happening at the time, and Ghislaine basically helped them resolve the fight. Like, there was these three kingdoms. This one kingdom was trying to frame another kingdom to make them attack each other, and Ghislaine basically helped them kill both the leaders of the other team. So essentially, Ghislaine completely turned the tides of a conflict in the conflict zone. But that also is important to note because, yes, as we find out from the conversation at the refugee camp, Ghislaine seen Philip and Hilda's bodies. Where did she see them? In the conflict zone. So that explains why Ghislaine was even there. She had teleported over there, and as she was heading back, looking for Rudeus and Edis, she ends up seeing both Philip and Hilda's bodies. Sad to think that that was in the novel, but they didn't really cover what exactly she's seen that was so horrific about Philip and Hilda's bodies. For our next one we have, it's not so much that it hurts anything not having it here, but it's sort of interesting to get into perspective of the extent of the eyes of Kishirika. When Rudeus initially meets Kishirika, she offers him a demon eye to repay him. She actually gives him the option of one of many eyes. This includes the Eye of Magical Power that allows you to see mana, see magic in something. The Eye of Identification, which I think is extremely funny because it only identifies things that she would know about. So essentially, if he sees something and uses it on something that Kishirika's never seen, there's no point to it. The Eye of X-Ray Visions, which honestly Kishirika believes that he would love because he's such a perv. But he's like, I like the process of taking clothes off. I don't need to be seeing people naked all the time. Plus, he's really afraid of seeing Rizard naked. It is also important to note that it cannot see through high concentrations of mana, and it cannot see through living creatures. Eye of Distant Sight was an interesting one, the idea that it allows you to see something from far, far away, which Rudeus believes is a useful tool, being able to see a threat before it comes to him, but he didn't like the idea of seeing something happening that he can't really be there to resolve. The last one is the Eye of Absorption. It gives the ability to essentially absorb mana, which sounds great, but it absorbs your own mana as well, so Rudeus is like, that can't be good. I think that would be amazing for somebody that is a melee fighter or something, somebody not using mana, because then essentially they can keep absorbing while they're fighting somebody, which I think is absolutely incredible. During Rudeus' stay at Doldia, one thing they skipped that I thought was kind of interesting at the point, and I was really curious if it would ever come up again, and it actually did. And by no shock to anybody, the anime skipped it because they can't cover it because they never established it to begin with. Yes, when Rudeus was in the Doldia village, he was taught by the chief how to use the Doldia Roar. And it's a specific thing to the Doldia tribe in that they have special vocal cords that can convert mana into a roar that can stun their opponent. And Rudeus tried it over and over again, but all he can really do is make somebody flinch. And so it's something that he never was able to pull off, which frustrated him because the Doldia tribe can use magic like he can, but he can't use their abilities, which kind of sucks. And yes, like I said earlier, this is something that I was wondering if they would ever bring up again, that Rudeus actually learned this, even though it's not really effective. And yes, it is brought up again in the period of time of the first season, the fight against Orsted. Yes, he tried to use the Doldia Roar against Orsted, but at the time, his lungs were collapsed and everything, so he couldn't really do anything. He couldn't project much. And it kind of shocked Orsted. He's like, whoa, what are you doing? Oh, all I see was mana come out. He couldn't understand what he was doing. And then we get into Milshin, which there is so much here that to unpack. Truly so much to unpack here. One of the biggest heartbreaks is the story behind Vierra and Shierra. Yes, for all those who don't remember watching the first season, the moment that Rudeus meets Paul again, there was two specific people behind Paul that Rudeus takes note of, really just the one of them. Vierra, who was the bikini warrior, and Shierra, who was the mage behind her that was always kind of cowering. There's a reason why they're dressed the way they are. Let me just say that. And it's really tragic to know that Rudeus made the assumption that Paul was essentially keeping somebody like Vierra around because she's dressed all sexy and everything. But when you actually hear about their story, it's truly heartbreaking. Essentially, the two of them were caught up in the displacement incident. And tragically, like many displaced women during the incident, they were taken advantage of. Men captured them and forced themselves upon them. And the tragic but interesting thing that comes from this whole incident is that Vierra and Shierra respond to it differently. Shierra becomes completely terrified of men after that point. That's why she gasps every time that Rudeus looks at her. She's terrified at the gazes of men. It makes her relapse into what she went through. So Vierra chose specifically to wear revealing outfits to draw the attention of the men to her, so that if she's ever in a room with Shierra, they won't look at Shierra. They will look at her. And it's so cool because following this, because Vierra believes that Paul had this falling out with Rudeus because she was dressed that way, she chose specifically to dress more casually. You get a brief glimpse of that the moment that Paul goes back to his room to see Norn and Vierra was there. Vierra had a cloak on. That was essentially them showing that she at that point, realizing that she may have caused that fight, she basically dressed more casual. She covered herself up. There's a lot of skip content in this town. And a lot of that skip content is Rudeus running into Vierra and how much she wants to help him out, how much she essentially tells him what Paul's been going through and what Paul's currently doing. She really does help him out a lot. I really like Shierra specifically because Shierra apparently is somebody of she's a walking library. Like, she knows so much stuff that normal people should never know. Like, she knows the exact cost of transporting a demon across the ocean. There's like all this information that she is like on the spot for. She's essentially Paul's bookkeeper. And so all of his schedule and everything, she knows everything that he's currently doing, what meetings he has planned. And so she's always kind of the one that steps out and goes, oh, well, he's doing this. You need this. Okay, this is the information you need. Oh, this costs this much. She is literally a walking library, which again, really makes me sad that they weren't emphasized really at all in the anime. And that's it. That's all I'm going to cover for this first part of the most insane things skipped in this anime adaptation of Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation, the novel series. As per usual, if you like this video, make sure that like button down below. I greatly appreciate your guys' support. Leave a comment. Let me know what you thought of this whole segment. Additionally, if you're new to the channel, make sure that subscribe button so you get all my content. I do news, reviews, first impressions, top list. If it's anime, it's pretty much here. Additionally, I have a Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation novel series analysis videos that I do every single Monday. I do a premiere. Everybody comes together and we talk about the novel series. Additionally, if you like this content and you want to support the channel more, we have a Patreon link, tips link, super thanks, and a membership button down below. I greatly appreciate it, but it does. And y'all take care.